Hello and welcome to a cornucopia of tales and tellers. Today we are very excited because there are four of us here. One, it's me, of course, Simona, and then there's Alan. Hello, Alan.
Evening, everybody.
And then there's David joining us. Hello,
Hello.
David.
Hello.
And last but not least, we are joined by Andrew Wright. Hello, Andrew.
Hello to all of you, and very nice to meet you for the first time, except in the case of David.
It's very nice to meet you too.
Mhm.
And Andrew, would you like to introduce yourself briefly to tell the audience who you are and what you do?
Well, it is a big question, isn't it? But and when I begin, it only just occurred to me this moment to say I should begin by saying I'm a story man, and it's because everybody is either a story man or a story woman, and I sometimes even think that my dog is. I think story is so fundamental. It's as fundamental as water is to a goldfish, in the sense that a goldfish needs water to swim about in. And that's what I feel. I feel that it's so fundamental, and more fundamental than perhaps we realize. Well, I know I shouldn't say that we realize. Who do I think I am? But many people, when they talk about why they're going to tell stories and be involved in stories, they say, well, they're interesting and they bring something into the classroom or whatever. But for me, they're simply more fundamental than that. Oh dear, I wasn't going to. Yes, no, I must say the next thing because it's become so important for me. Stories create war. It's big stuff that we're dealing with. Of course, when we tell an individual story, Beauty and the Beast or something. If we tell an individual story, then of course there's a beginning and a middle and an age, and an end, and there's a main protagonist who gets what he or she wants or doesn't or whatever. That's story. But at the same time, I have to begin it with this seriousness. I'm sorry, because it's become so important for me. In the country next to the one I live in Hungary at the moment, and next door is Ukraine. And there's this awful war going on. And the way I see it is that this is based on a story. And the story is Putin, by the way, I'm not trying to be God Almighty. This is my understanding, my perception of the situation. And if people feel that this is wrong, then please go ahead. But I don't want to say this is how I see it. As I understand it, Putin, as a boy, was a street boy, a street fighter. And then when he got into the KGB, he found some sense of identity. And when he could walk down the street, he was a KGB officer. He was somebody. And then when the big political changes came in the late 80s, and Russia lost a lot of its power, okay, that was a country. But he as an individual lost his sense of power because he had found his sense of identity through being a serious person in society, an officer. And so that was his story that he lived by. And then he decided as he got older, he would have to do something about it. And so he started this war. But so you don't think I'm just going to talk about Russia. Let me talk about Trump. What did Trump say when he was electioneering? I'm going to make America great again. He used almost the same phrase as Putin. All right, but let's go to jolly England now. Well, is it Britain? I never know quite. Are you UK or Britain? But anyway, with the royal family. And they are a living story. And the Queen did her best to act out her part. And every so often they used phrases like, Britain is great. And so the idea of living within a story is what allows us to go through infinite complexity, because things are too complex. I've just been learning about the new definition of a genome, which has been based on is it 47 people or something like that, and and now they've made it more complicated, and it's incredibly complicated. And then the number of stars in the universe. There are more stars in the universe than there are grains of sand on every desert in the world and every beach. What an idea. How do we live in this complexity? And we must have a path to walk through this forest of complexity, and somebody will give us a path to walk on. And so, as you can see, I didn't plan to say this at all. I'm so consumed by it at the moment. And the relationship I see between story as we usually use it, like, a Beauty and the Beast, and this other idea of story. Sometimes I call this other bigger concept a story map, because the story is acting like a map to guide us through our everyday. This is what, for example, now I'm an old man. This is what an old man does. This is what's expected of him, and not. But this is what I can expect of people and situations where I go in. It applies to everybody. Everybody. I'm not being superior in any kind of way. I'm just part of this as I see it. And then, of course, when we tell a story, an individual story, like perhaps I'm going to tell this story of Seal Wife a little later, then that will contribute values and perceptions and behaviors to the way in which we make our big story map that guides us every day. So all those values, perceptions, all the things that we four are doing when we're telling stories are helping people to make, perhaps change the way they look at things and the way they behave and so on. We've seen so many examples of this. The role of women particularly is so striking for me in the story map that we live by. So there was this girl, wasn't there, this princess who had to wait for eternity for a man to come along and kiss her before she no, we can't have that. But that is not on anymore. I mean, it's a ridiculous story map, in my opinion. That value system is just simply not on. And how striking it is that in storytelling of the kind which we see in films and so on, we see women having a different role altogether. And I think I've just finished on this. I watch a lot of Sky News when I'm in Hungary because it's my way of keeping in touch. And I love the way that they're going to call in a serious voice from industry. And it's a woman. I love it. Again and again and again these days, in this last year or two. And this is part of story. We're being told a story. Everything we do is part of story. And the stories we four are telling to people are part of that. So that's, as far as introduction is concerned, I went to art school. I'll do this very quickly. I went to art school, and I like to do things which I could not abstract painting, because I liked content. But at the art school I went to, that was regarded as being very bad. It was called illustrative, you see, and that was regarded as being not real painting. So I was given the feeling of, this is not on, it's not real painting. But still, after that, I wanted to write and I wanted to paint, and I began to do things for German children's television. I sent them stories, and I did all the pictures for them. That was in the 1960s, not 1860s, 1960s. I'm not so old. And so I did those children's stories for them, and then British publishers saw them, and they were made into British books. E.J. Arnold, it was called. And then I began to work in the world of language teaching in the mid-60s, and as an illustrator. But because I could speak French, I'd lived in France by that time. I was one of the artists who could speak in French. And so I worked with the writers and became a writer in language teaching. That's how I came into the world of language teaching. I came in as an artist doing the pictures. But because I knew France and I was writing stories for German television at the same time privately, then that's how I came in as a writer, illustrator. And then, amazingly, some teachers were interested in hearing me. I began to do workshops in 1967 or 1968, I think it was. Incredible time ago. So funny, really, when you think about it. And then one of the contributions I could make was with stories again. So making stories. And then when I began to work with teachers, they said it's a pity if you can't come into school, can you stay overnight? And that's how my work in schools began. As early as, I don't know, the 1960s, early 70s, began working in schools in that way, linking it with working with teachers. And then that became very, very important, so that when I was really touring in schools and not working with teachers so much, I was doing every day a different school, and every day it was 6 hours. So I did 6 hours a day. Then I did 5 different schools in the week. And then on one tour, it was 16 weeks long. So I did 16 weeks times 5 days times 6 hours. And in every lesson, I was with a minimum of the class size, 30, 40 children. But sometimes the school would give me double class. So by the end of the week, I'd worked with between 1,500 and 2,000 children. And I was traveling in my van. So I slept in my van. And if I got a job in Vienna, for example, in a city, I would look up where it was. Then I would drive there the night before at midnight when the streets were empty and park outside the school. So I didn't have to struggle with the traffic in the morning. Then I could do a full day and then came back to my van after the school to look at where I'd be the next day. So all that was and I adored it. And when I was working with the children, I always said, can you speak English? Of course they could. And I said, well, perhaps I can hear your English. Ask me questions. So I was trying to find a relationship with them in that way, by asking them to ask me anything they wanted to, have you got babies? Have you got pets? This, that, and the other. And then that always then gave me a natural lead into a story that could come in the next part of, and I developed that as a way of approaching. I had to have some kind of pattern, because if you're doing it 6 times in a day, and then you're doing it for 5 days, and then you do it for 16 weeks. And that particular tour I'm thinking of, I began in the north of Denmark and worked all the way through Denmark, Germany, Austria, and I finished in the center of Italy 16 weeks later. So I was going from one country to another, sleeping either in the cities or sleeping in the forest or things like that, and I adored it. So I've always seen myself as a mixture of a story maker, and that goes very deep with me. I have to make things.
So can we talk about your story poems then? What can you tell us about that? Would be very keen to hear about that.
Well, I've written a number of collections of stories, short stories myself already, which are out. And then I wanted to collect together all the poems that I've written through my life. I'm not a poet really, but I seem to have written, I don't know, 200 pages of poems. And what's so striking about poems and poetry writing is the how do you pronounce it? Prosody of poetry. That is the form of the language plays a bigger role than it does normally in storytelling. I know that in storytelling, we have to try to be as precise as we can. And if we can find words which are expressive, of course, there are times when fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Now, that's prosody of poetry. And of course, that can play a big part in stories. But usually it plays only a limited part, perhaps at a particular point where there's some kind of repetition of a sentence, like your fee, fi, fo, fum. But poetry is all about the sound. Like music is all about the sound. There may be a singer accompanying it, but it is the sound living in its own powerful form. And so I've realized that some of my poetry contain this element of story in it. But at the same time, by my estimation, it is poetry. I can give you an example if you like an example.
Please do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. The first thing to say is this story. Oh yes, there we are. This is my draft. It's going to the printers actually within the next few days. But this is what I'm looking at now. And oh, by the way, you can see on the cover, I've got puppets.
Yeah.
Yes, and if I could just show
Is that
you.
puppets behind you as well?
Yes, I have.
And did you make them?
No, these are from Thailand. I bought these half a century ago, and it was at the time when television was beginning to go into the villages, and the puppet troops were having to give up their job, and the puppets were just in the market for tuppence. And I've got them here. See here are a lot of them, and there you can see them there.
Yeah.
And then here, they're all there.
Some of these guys are ex-TV celebrities then?
Big pun?
Some of these would be ex-television celebrities, these puppets?
They were instead of in the villages that people.
Okay. Oh, I get you. Sorry.
That's
Yeah.
what I mean.
Yeah.
It was, but they are pre-television, and then the puppet troops that had been working for 1,000 years suddenly had no job, and I bought these beautiful puppets. I've also been to Java. There, I got some work storytelling in Java, but I was able to go to see the puppet theatres there, the living puppet theatres. So that was wonderful. They were shadow theatres in Java, of course. So that's why I put them on my cover, because these puppets are all around me, and not every day, but I really do hear them very often complaining bitterly to me. You bought us and you took us home, and we were believing that at last we can tell stories again, and you just have us hanging here. In fact, one of the poems begins, the big puppet over there, he's got a moustache. He's rather senior. This is his complaint to me. String by the top of my head, waiting to tell my story, waiting year after year, here, amongst 1,000 other stories in the room. Your unicycle. Oh, now I should show you my unicycle. Can you see it?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
hanging from the
Yeah.
ceiling. Yeah.
Yeah, that's my unicycle. I used to ride that. I can't do it now. Very I can't even ride a bicycle now. But anyway, it doesn't matter. He's complaining about it, the unicycle. He says, your unicycle hangs over there behind me, ignominiously. It took you down hillsides, bumped you from stone to stone across the shallow rivers. Do you remember the stories you told? Thousands of years ago, you began, men and women became discontent with the limited power of their locomotory organs. They looked with envy upon the speed of four-footed animals and upon the denizens of sea and sky. It's the puppet complaining. I was telling stories about a blooming unicycle, and what about him? He's complaining about this. I know, of course he didn't. It came into my head. But I wrote down what I heard, and I said, nice. Stories, yes, but what about us? Hanging unnoticed, still as a magnetized pin, silent as a footless corridor, going nowhere, hanging unnoticed. Puppets have feelings. But now you're writing stories. Pull the strings, and I will speak and be. Yes, quite philosophical, that. It can only be if we tell
Beautiful.
stories. So
Love it.
Thank you, Andrew. That's fantastic. What a beautiful, powerful poem about story.
perhaps just one more from the
Yeah.
poetry,
Certainly.
because it was just 2 weeks ago I wrote this, because I'd left a ladder, a tall ladder, not step ladder, but a tall ladder in the garden. And it just happened the moon was in the sky above the ladder. And I felt I heard this story, so I photographed it. Perhaps I can show you. There.
Ah, yes, yeah.
See, there's the ladder, and there's the moon. A ladder to the moon. He saw the moon, metaphorically, waving to him. Come up, sweetheart. I'm here, alone, thinking, dreaming of you. You can't fly. Find a ladder, and up you come. You can do it. And I will wait for you, gleaming in my whiteness, promising all your dreams. So he got a ladder, and up he went, and I've seen nothing of him since that time. I couldn't not put
It's
it in.
beautiful.
It's a story, isn't it? But it's a poem.
Yes.
It is a
Mhm.
poem. Yeah, so
And-
anyway, I should.
And Andrew,
Yes.
maybe it's not metaphorically that the moon was waving at her lover. Maybe it was the rabbit in the moon. Are you
Oh,
familiar with the rabbit stories?
No.
There are a number of stories. I learned this from David. There are a number of stories about the rabbit in the moon or on the moon. I don't know which one would be the right one here,
I
because
think it could be either, but yeah, all the way in, certainly in China and Japan, and certainly in Mexico, there are many stories about rabbit in the moon.
Aye.
But the moon is inhabited by many beings in different cultures around the world.
Yeah.
Can I just say, Andrew, I just want to refer to our connection and our friendship, because I had heard about you and had read books that you had written before I met you back in about 2005, and I met you at the IATEFL conference through the IATEFL community.
Yes.
And I think what happened very quickly is there was a connection, because although, as you say in your own words, we approach storytelling not in exactly the same way, we have different approaches, we both have storytelling at the heart of our practice in ELT. And I feel that you were like a guide, one of a few guides in my life who brought me in the direction that I am now as a storyteller. And I just want to acknowledge that relationship, because over many years we worked together, hosting story sharing events for teachers from around the world at IATEFL. And then I think our last trip together, we were both invited to a storytelling day, a festival or conference, I suppose we should call it, in Porto, in Portugal, in 2019, which was just before the pandemic hit. And there you gave a plenary talk at that conference where you talked about what you shared with us just now about infinite complexity and much more. But that's where you began, and it made a huge impact on me, that talk on what story is, because you're talking at that kind of molecular genome level about, you know, what story is for humanity. I don't really know where I'm going with this. I just wanted to make a connection between you and me and many of the people who are going to be listening today. Would you acknowledge that you were largely responsible for bringing storytelling into the ELT community?
Well, I feel very. I would never say that myself. I couldn't. I feel uncomfortable hearing it. But I suppose there weren't so obvious people about telling stories, and certainly in terms of stories, traditional stories being accepted, apart from, you know, a primary school, forget that for a moment, but in society, they weren't highly rated, in my opinion. And it's interesting that the what are they called in England, the Storytellers Association, what's it called? I can't remember.
The Society for Storytelling?
Yes. And wasn't that started in the 1990s?
I believe that was before I had even, you know, found out what storytelling was, but it would have been around the 1990s.
People were beginning to get to identify themselves at that time, and I had been writing stories, but I'd been living as a story writer for the German television, and so I had informally, when I was going off to work with teachers, I had worked with children as well, all over the place. I started working as a storyteller in the Manchester area in England in that way in the 1990s. And it was then, but I was still a kind of unknown storytelling man in that way. And that was when I heard that Duncan Williamson was going to be performing in Edinburgh at the festival. And I'd heard about him. And so that was a big turning point for me. You probably know this story.
Well, I know Duncan Williamson and his work very well, but maybe not everybody does. So would you like to just give us a bit of context about who Duncan Williamson was and the influence he still exerts?
Well, Duncan, I can't remember when he died. Was it 2005 or about the time we met? Something like that. I don't remember. He died some time ago. But he was what is called a traveller. And he distinguished between being a traveller and a gypsy. He asked me to look at his eyes. He said, look, I've got blue eyes because we are the original people in Scotland. We were here 2,000 years ago. And the gypsy people have dark eyes. And their culture overlaps with ours a bit, particularly related to horses and storytelling, but still we're different people. So Duncan Williamson was from these traveller people in Scotland. That's the first thing. And then he was born in a tent on the shore of Loch Fyne. Loch Fyne is a sea inlet coming in north of Glasgow, a sea inlet. And in the winter, his father always erected that, because they erected tents. They had to erect them out of trees. And they covered, he said, when he was a boy, they covered the tent with canvas. But he said in his father's time, they were seal skins that they covered the tents with. And then they made the tent as long as was necessary for the number of children that they happened to have at that time. So he said he wasn't he one of 12 children or something like that. So the tent was really quite long. And that was where he was born. Anyway, let me go back to it. So the festival, I went to the festival and watched him, and there were a few others of the top English tellers, really good people. But it was Duncan that I was there. I wanted to see this. And then after the show, I was leaving and the storytellers were going out. And as they went past me, Duncan took my arm. I was a member of the audience. I mean, I was a nobody for him. He took my arm. He said, "What's your name?" I said, "Andrew." He said, "Come with us. We're going to a ceilidh." I didn't know what a ceilidh was. And we went to a room. Cameron, maybe it was belonging to somebody called Cameron. Anyway, who was another storyteller. We went to his room. There were about 30 people in the room. And then we're just generally chatting, and I had no idea what was going to happen. And then Duncan said, "Now we should have a few stories. So tell us a story, sing us a song, show us your bum, or out you gang." And have you ever begun like that, David? Show us your bum or out your gang. And then they began telling stories.
Definitely tell a story in that situation.
Yeah.
That's the tagline for IATAFL next year.
They're so funny. And they began telling these stories around the room. And then I could see it was going to come to me. And everybody had to tell a story, sing a song, or show your bum out your gang. Well, I thought, people, no one wants to see my bum around it. And so I thought I'd better try to tell a story. So I told a story. And then I'm telling you now, a great moment in my life. Really, there was a turning point, huge. Duncan, when I'd finished my story, he stood up and he said, "I'm going to sing you a song, Andrew. You're a story man, and I'm going to sing you my song that I've written. It's a ballad." And then he came across the room and he knelt in front of me. And he told a story about, they were on their site there where their tents were that time, but an old man came to them in the evening, and they tried to persuade him to stay the night, but he wouldn't. He wouldn't stay, and he went on his way. And then the next morning, the police came, and they told them, "We found a dead old man in the forest. Is he one of yours? And we said, no, he's the man that came to see us. Anyway, he then sang me this song, absolutely beautiful. And his wife, Linda, just a few weeks ago now, anyway, she sent me the song which he sang to me, which he'd written. And she sent me the music. And I've just found somebody here in Goodilla who can read music. And she is going to help me to learn this song.
Wow.
Because
Brilliant.
Linda said she would love the idea if I could sing Duncan's song. Oof.
Oh, that's really nice. Oh,
Oh.
that's so nice.
Oh, dear. You can see I'm so moved by it. And after that, I'd met him. I was living in Manchester at that time in my life, and he stayed with us several times. So I got to know him, my wife, my second wife, Julia, when we had our first baby, we went and stayed with him in Stirling. Stirling, that's above Edinburgh, isn't it? That bit of Scotland there, Stirling, yes. He'd moved into a cottage because this girl, Linda, who is his wife now, she was when she met him, just a young American girl doing a PhD in folklore, and she arrived at this traveller place where they were sleeping in their tents and things like that, to interview him. And Duncan's first wife had died, and it was in the tent with 8 children. So very reasonably, she decided to marry him and have some children with him as well. And so she had 2 or 3 children with him in the tent. But because she was not used to that kind of life, living in a tent, she persuaded him, the first person in the 2,000 years that he knew about, that had ever lived in a house. And now there was 2 children, our top business people. They were brought up in the tent and then taken out of the tent when they were sort of in their early teens. Yes, isn't it fascinating? And so she married him, and he was very lucky. He was very lucky to have her, because first of all, she's a lovely, lovely human being. But also because she's such a good academic. That's the reason why there are a lot of books with his name on, and the stories are there, because she was able, that was her life. She knew how to do that. She could put everything down and get it published. And that's when he began to get those invitations to America as a top story man. And Julia and I and our baby Timmy stayed in that cottage that he had a ceilidh in there. Yeah.
I do love a good ceilidh. As an Irishman, I do love a good ceilidh now.
oh yes.
These stories about how we receive the mantle of becoming a storyteller, the person who says,
oh yes,
you're a story man, you're a storyteller.
Oh yes.
Significant moments. I mean, for me, it was our very good friend Mario Rinvolucri.
Yes.
Said to me, David, you're a storyteller.
Yes.
And because I had such huge respect for Mario, and because he was a storyteller himself,
yes,
that was a hugely significant moment for me.
Yeah.
So this passing on of the, this naming it's like a rite of passage. It is a rite of passage.
It's actually, perhaps I could link it to my obsession with the idea of a story map. Because when Mario did that to you, said that, he wasn't redrawing your story map, but he was modifying your story map so that you realized, gosh, I'm on my map. I am a story man part of this map, because he helped you to recognize, because obviously he didn't make you into the storyteller, because you are fundamentally a story man well before you met Mario. But he, as you say, he helped you to recognize your map, and which you had to perhaps change the map a bit so that that's what you've become. And by the way, I think I told you that I think your site that you have is very nicely done. I like it very much. You came along for me very much at the right time, because I loved doing what I was doing at ITEFL. I was very, very, very proud of being associated with it. But I didn't have the wits about me to expand it and deepen it like you've done brilliantly. And you have this ability to also not only to broaden people's horizons, but also a very personal one of making people feel confident that they can contribute, whoever they are. And that's what always struck me when we were working together. You did that very nicely indeed. So,
I want to just mention this year at IATEFL, just a couple of weeks ago, I co-hosted with Harry Kucha Kucha, former president from Cameroon. And last year, I co-hosted with Alan here when we were in Belfast. So
Belfast last year, that was a lot of fun.
Huge pleasure. This year, just a couple of weeks ago, there was a teacher called Sylvia. I think her pronunciation of her surname is Dolokova, Sylvie Dolokova from Czech Republic. And she told the story. And afterwards, I said to her, that's wonderful storytelling. And she said, I had the best teacher. And I said, oh, who was your teacher? Andrew Wright.
gosh.
This would have been years ago. She would have been at a workshop that you led. I don't know whether it would have been in Czech Republic or in the UK, but all of these interconnections, I find it fascinating, this passing on of, and again with her, she was clearly a story woman or storyteller who just had this natural ability that she had then developed to entrance an audience, pass on her culture because she told a Czech story.
Yes.
But it's not like you said, it's not linear. It's a complex web of what brings us to where we are.
Yes.
And takes us on the next the journey forwards.
What I feel is that when we make something, just for a moment we experience infinity. As I come into this last bit of my life, I'm so conscious of it being the last part of life, and then when I'm involved in writing and making stories and writing the poetry, at those moments I have an extraordinary feeling that I'm ageless. It's wonderful at making of things, living at that moment.
I feel there's something about that in storytelling when you tell, because so I at the minute I'm teaching a lot of refugees and asylum seekers in Belfast. We have exams at the minute, so I'm covering classes, which means there's been no preparation. So I've brought storytelling into the classroom, and it's the easiest thing to break down barriers, but also you're almost every age at once. It's kind of like what you've just said. It's like, they're all adults, but at one point they're sort of the childish wonder never leaves, no matter what a lot of people have gone through. There's one thing I want to say. It's just this really weird coincidence, but it was the first thing you said about stories and where you are in Hungary with your next door neighbors and the issues going on there. So I do a lot of graded readers with some of the lower level students. And one of them this week had rented out of the library The Diary of Anne Frank. She did not know who Anne. No, she's a Ukrainian adult. She had no idea who Anne Frank was, and she had written on her homework. I thought it was a love story between two teenagers. Which I was really scared to read what her next paragraph was, because she finished the book. But she immediately turned it into almost a story of the comparisons between Anne Frank's life and her life. Getting out of a city in Ukraine to get here. I just think it's really interesting how you mentioned the stories of what's going on there now, and she today, without meaning to, it was a book review homework, but she ended up telling me her story and how she compared it with Anne Frank. I just think was just incredibly powerful what she'd gone through, and she'd quite struggling. She'd obviously edited it down to be clean enough as a homework, but her and her family had obviously gone through a lot, and I think it was interesting that it was Anne Frank that she had randomly selected out of the library, and then saw the comparisons, and her story came through with that. She's clearly a story person and has a very important story to tell. Goes back to, what was it, 1943, I think. The Anne Frank diary came out. It's just funny how you mentioned that earlier, and today that was what I was reading at 3:30. It was just the similarities was terrifying.
Andrew, would you do us the honor of telling us a story?
Well, I would like to, yes, I will try to tell you that Rory McCordrum, the Seal Wife story, because I loved it so much. Take into account that I've not told it for, I don't know, 15 years, something like that. But it did mean a lot to me. So Rory McCordrum, he was a fisherman, and he lived on an island just off the coast of Scotland, Berneray, this island. He lived by himself on this island. There was just his cottage and his boat. Now he often thought about the seals. Every time he went fishing, there were the seals in the sea around the island. But they called them the seal people, and it bothered him. He'd never seen the seals on that day in the year when they landed on the shore, took their seal skins off, and played and danced and enjoyed themselves. His father had seen them, and his grandfather, but he'd never seen them. It didn't seem right. And then one day when he was leaving his cottage, he heard the sound of the people calling to each other and laughing. But no, he lived on his island. He thought, there must be visitors here. And he was looking around, he couldn't see a boat. So he crept towards them, bending down so he couldn't be seen. And he crouched behind some rocks so he could peep over. And there were 10, 12, 14 young men and women dancing and laughing and enjoying themselves. But he couldn't see a boat. And then he realized that under the rocks where he was were the rolled up skins of the seal people. Oh, his father had never found a seal skin. Black and silver and golden brown. He took one and he put it under his jacket. And he ran back, bent double so they wouldn't see him, back to his cottage, into the cottage, and then shut the door. And when he was standing holding his skin, what could he do with it? He thrust it under the thatch just above the door, pushed it underneath so it couldn't be seen. And then he wasn't sure what to do with himself. it kindled his fire, a peat fire there, and he had to mend some nets. So he started mending his nets. He was mending his nets that evening when there was a knock at the door. And nobody lived on the island. And he opened the door, and there was a young woman, long golden brown hair, hiding her comeliness. I love that. Hiding her comeliness. And she said, mortal man, please help me. I've lost my sealskin. Without my sealskin, I cannot return to the sea with my brothers and sisters. And he knew that just above her head was a sealskin. He couldn't give it to her. He was so alone on that island. Come in, he said. Sit down. She sat down by the fire. He put a blanket round her shoulders, and she said again, mortal man, please help me. Without my sealskin, I cannot return to the sea with my brothers and sisters. And he couldn't give it to her. And then he said, stay and be my wife, for I will love you all my life. Without my sealskin, I cannot return to the sea. Without you, I cannot live on this earth. So I will marry you. And they married. And they came to love each other. And they had 2 bairns, 2 children. And the children learned her sad songs. And they were known as Rora McCodrum's seal children. And they grew as a family. Now there's one day when the wind was blowing, but he had to go out to fish. And then when he went outside, a hare bounded across in front of him. And in Scotland, I understand that this is very unlucky. And perhaps he should have turned round. But he didn't. He thought, if the wind freshens, then I'll turn the boat round, I can come back. And the wind did freshen, became too strong even for him. He turned the boat around and sailed for home. And as he came towards the coast, he saw his children standing by the water's edge. His wife wasn't there. He beats the boat and he ran towards them, his heart heavy like a stone. What is it, children? What are you doing here? And they said, the wind was very gusty, Dad. The door burst open and then slammed, and something fell from the roof. And Mum ran forward, and then she picked it up and she began to laugh. And she said, children, I've got to go. And she was crying and laughing at the same time. And she went down to the sea and she put this thing on and dived into the water and swam away, and she hasn't come back. And she never did come back. And the children grew and became famous, singing those same sad songs which they learned from their mother. And when he went fishing, he looked around, always looked around at the seals bobbing in the water around him, but never saw a golden brown seal again. Oof.
Oof, indeed.
Oof.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Gosh, I can't really, I shouldn't tell it more than it once every 20 years. I think that.
That's one of those ones that stick with you.
Yes. Yes, that's right. Yes.
Wonderful story and a wonderful telling. And Andrea, I've got to tell you,
Yes.
when you started telling your story, it started raining here, and it was very atmospheric because I felt like
yes.
in Scotland with the rain and your
yes.
story. And when it reached, I don't know what you did. You did something magical, because when you reached the apex, it started raining more heavily, and I was like, oh gosh, what's happening?
Oh, these are
That
wonderful.
was brilliant.
Oh gosh. Gosh. Wonderful.
Isn't it fascinating? That story is told in variant form in just about every culture in the world.
Yes.
And it's a story about human. Well, it's just about who we are, isn't it? The frailty, the weaknesses we have, and the yearnings we have. It's about. Well, it's about so much. But thank you so much. You Andrew, you brought that story. It's the emotional connection to the stories you tell that I've always loved about your story. There's much I love about the way you tell stories, but there's one thing that I've always noticed, and it's how Andrew connects to a story in such a way that you connect us all to the story and to the emotion. It's more than the emotion, it's the truth of the story.
When I hear you giving some kind of, looking for some kind of what might be behind it, perhaps that idea that I began with at the beginning, the idea of story map and story, it's perhaps in this story, because Seal Wife, she felt her story map was where she'd been born and brought up. That was her Ukraine. That's where she was brought up. That is where she belonged. And so she came to love him because she was big-hearted, big-minded. She did. But deep down, her home was the sea. So perhaps there is a connection between that idea of story map and story, perhaps.
I think it comes into identity as well. I think there's a lot of. I think it's just the intertwinedness of the map, the person, and the identity as well. I think it's fantastic. I'm aware there's an Irish version of that. We may have. The UK has Selkies as well. Then, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
We would have them out west, yeah.
Particularly Scotland, the west coast of Scotland, I think.
Yes.
I was completely taken by that. That was phenomenal.
Andrew, I'm so grateful that you were you were able to join us and pass on your experience, your wisdom, your passion for storytelling.
Well, I've loved being with you again. not least because I've been so apart from people who are so involved in stories. I've been so apart from you. Apart from this wretched boy up here.
Well, Andrew, if you're interested, there are numerous events on Zoom that I and Simona, and particularly I and Simona, maybe arrange and host. There are many events, and I feel these story sharing events on Zoom or online, when I first did it, it was hard for me to believe that I would feel this close connection with people in other parts of the world. But I soon got over that and realized actually we can feel very connected through storytelling.
Oh yes, of course. I'm in this group of writers, which is organized by Alan Maley.
I'm not in it, but I know all about it. And Alan,
I know about
Alan
it.
does.
Yeah.
Alan, who's a very good friend of Andrew's and a good friend of mine, that hosts, gets people doing creative writing and poetry writing all over the world. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, what's so striking for me there is that where we're from is a matter of interest, but it just like you were saying, how close you can be related. I was paired with somebody called Dat Bayo, who was in this group, and we did a joint project together, and we were corresponding almost every day to organize it. This is a funny thing. I didn't know whether Dat Bayo was a girl or a boy, a man or a woman. I didn't know, because he or she was just signing it Dat. And I didn't feel that our work was anything to do with being whether you were a man and a woman. And I thought, get on with it. It doesn't make any difference. So I didn't find out for something like 2 months that I was working with a boy, a man. It's funny, isn't it? I love that idea. I think it's brilliant. I have no idea. I used to a long time ago. I used to do a lot of work in Italy, and I loved it. It was like I remember there was one time, I think I was in Florence, and I had about 200 people, and I was trying to give my talk at the front, and there was one lady right at the front, sitting on the road, just as near to me as my computer screen here, as near as that. And she was talking to me all the time, saying, yes, it is wonderful. I do that all the time. He's a wonderful man. He is right. And I was saying, I said to her, please, excuse me, it's so encouraging for me. And everybody started to laugh. And so that was one thing I remembered from there, which I just loved it, the character coming out. And then somebody else as character. Halfway through my talk, he or she put his hand up. I said, yes. She said, could you just repeat what you said? I said, oh, I'm so sorry. Wasn't I very clear? No, I wasn't listening. I don't know why, but I felt so close to this. It sounds mad, and it is self-centered. At the same time, it was so warm-hearted and so much to do with sharing.
Each of them felt that you were talking to them personally.
Yes.
Yeah, personal performances.
And this is what we do as storytellers. People feel that we're talking to you individually.
Yes, and I think I love those trips in Italy, probably as much as in any country I've ever worked in.
And that's a lot of countries.
Yes, I've worked. Julie worked out. I've worked in 55 countries.
Wow.
Not in Ireland, virtually not in Ireland. But the one thing I remember from I have a prejudice about the Irish, which is that all Irish people are storytellers. And I remember one Irishman telling me about his sister, and he said, "Forgive me if I try to say it in my idea of Irish. Please forgive me, because I don't want to be silly, but this is how I kind of heard it. He said, "She's that tin. She can be splitting the hailstone with her nose." What an image! Brilliant, isn't it?
Well, that's good. Funny you mentioned that. I did a couple of years ago when I came back from Sardinia to Ireland. I did a job interview, and they had spotted on my CV. I do actually have a qualification in storytelling, which I was tutored by Liz Weir and Stephen O'Hara here.
Oh yes.
And the director of the school actually said, "Why did you do that? Surely we just talk anyway. You don't need a certificate in talking. Your passport is your qualification."
Yes. Well, I'm prejudiced towards that idea. Yes, Liz Weir, she was one of the people. She was in the 90s when storytelling was being established.
She's still going strong.
Yes.
If I recall correctly, she's about 20 kilometers up the road right now telling a story in Ballygally right now, yeah.
Oh,
she was a fantastic tutor for me as well. Absolutely phenomenal.
I bet she was, yes. Oh, that's another story. Because, so, Timmy now, Timmy is 28, I think, something like 28. She's not 30. I told her that she should get used to the idea that she's nearly 30, because that's when you become middle-aged. But she doesn't want to think in those terms. Well, that's reasonable. So let's say she's 28. She left school at 18, and she instantly went to Vietnam. Instantly. And she got herself a motorbike and lived by teaching English there for a year. And then she met a boy and put him on the motorbike. And then they began to drive back overland past Mount Everest to India and down and so on. Cut a long story short, in this 10-year period, she's been homeless. She's only been traveling around, and she either works in bars or she does busking. And in any country, she can go out and earn 20 or 30 pounds. And for example, last summer, I didn't know where she was at all. I had no idea which country. But that's the thing about modern technology. I just pressed a number and she answered immediately. And she said, sorry, Dad, I've only got 10 minutes. I said, what do you mean you've only got 10 minutes? Where are you? We've got the best place for gigs, for busking in the town. I said, but which country are you in? She said, Portugal. We're in Lisbon. We're on the sea's edge, and we're on in minutes. And that's her. And then,
where does she get that that itinerant mentality from, Andrew?
Well, you may not know this, but before she was born, when Julia was 7 months pregnant, I got an extended tour in Brazil, 6 weeks of teacher training and working with children for 6 weeks. And Julia was insistent on coming with me, although she was 7 months pregnant. And then Julia, because the jungle is in Brazil, Julia doesn't want to miss anything. So we went to the jungle, and she hired a man with long hair who took us into the Amazon jungle. There wasn't even a footpath there. And he was in front, and then we followed him in, but Timmy was inside her into the Amazon jungle. And we walked for hours, and then we came to a beautiful stream. It wasn't the Amazon river there. It was just a little stream, but it was clear. And I said I wanted to swim, and Julia said, I want to swim as well. And she told the man, the guide, to look the other way so she could take clothes off. And then she and I and Timmy inside her, we were swimming around in this little river somewhere in the Amazon jungle. That's how Timmy began her life. And indeed, I was touring. After that, I was touring in Austria, because when she was born in Budapest, 2 weeks later, she and Timmy arrived in Austria, because I was doing a 2-week tour in Austria, and she just, they both of them toured around with me. And then the same year, I was paid to go to Israel to work there for several months, that was. And then that very day, that very year, I was invited to work at JALT in Japan. And they wanted to come with me there as well. And so Timmy's been doing this ever since she was born. But now she's fallen in love with an Australian bass guitar player who she met in Berlin. And she joined him, and she's fallen in love with him now. And now that she's now, you don't want somebody who you love very much to be on the other side of the world. It's very inconvenient. She's north of Sydney, and they live by the sea in a house left by a millionaire, because it was becoming a bit decrepit, but it's huge, and they don't have to pay any rent. So she and this bass player and several other musicians and 2 artists all live in this house for nothing. And it's only 100 meters from the ocean. Isn't it amazing?
Amazing.
And the koala bears and kangaroos leaping about some. And then the other day, just last week, so Julia decided this is modern technology, I'm going to ring your sister now. So she rang up Timmy in the east of Australia and said, Timmy, could you talk to your sister, please? And so there was this perfect picture. This is how old we are. We've all grown into this amazing age. Here's a sister, beautiful video, talking to her sister, calming her sister down in Hungary. And it doesn't cost a penny. It's a mad world.
It's an ever-changing world, but how interesting that you told us so much about Duncan Williamson, who was a traveller.
Yes.
And you're a traveller, and your daughter is a traveller.
Yes.
And stories travel.
And stories.
There's so many connections.
Oh, yes. No, you're very good connection. Yes. I do hope we're going to be together again. Really, I would love that very much indeed.
We'll be together either in person or we're together now, Andrew.
Yeah, that's true.
There's always Zoom. Yeah.
Yes. I think this for me is going to be one of those turning points for me. I hope so, because I've missed your company for so long now, and I've enjoyed it so much. So, bye-bye.
Well, thank you very much for tonight.
Equally for us. Thank you so much. And
we can always do part 2.
Yeah.
Yes.
You're always welcome back on the podcast, Andrew.
Yes.
Honestly,
raining again.
This could be episode 1 of 100 when it comes to Andrew's stories.
Well,
Andrew, thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight.
All right. Well, bye everybody. Happy storytelling.
Really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you very
too.
much.